with the Milken Institute, where we work at the intersection of health and finance, because without healthy people, you can't have thriving economies. And as our chairman, Mike Milken, often reminds me, each life is precious and each life is priceless. But purely in economic terms, over the past 2 centuries, 50% of all economic growth can be traced to advances in health. So with that, I'm just going to ask my panelists, we've got 3 different perspectives today. I'm just going to ask them to quickly introduce themselves so we can dive right into the content, if you want to start, Joe.
Sure. Joe Natauri. I am the managing partner and founder of Invidia, capital management. I've been in the healthcare industry for 26 years, just left Goldman last year, where I was global head of their healthcare investing business.
Thomas Larsen. Work with the External Strategies Group at the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. We invest about $90 billion with external managers, and one of the key areas where we allocate is to the healthcare sector.
Great, Chris Bardon. I'm actually a physician by training, and I work at MPM Capital, which is one of the world's largest dedicated biotech investors. We focus primarily on drug development, and all of our investment professionals are actually scientists and physicians.
That's great. So we've got the private perspective, the allocator perspective, and a public perspective here today, which is great. So let's start with what are the most exciting trends in health tech or life sciences that you're seeing right now?
Yeah, and I can start. So on the private side, I'm in the middle market buyout space. So the way I think about healthcare is really from probably a more seasoned perspective in terms of an industry. AI is something that everybody's talking about, especially today. For healthcare, I actually think some of these events of making this technology more commoditized is actually what's going to effectuate change in healthcare. People forget sometimes in healthcare, it's always a cost question, not necessarily a technology question sometimes. And so the ability to use AI in what I think is actually the largest data set globally, so 30% of the global data is generated just by the healthcare industry, is going to have meaningful impact. But the only way to get that technology to penetrate is to bring the cost down. Mm-hmm. So I think some of this evolution around AI and tech and the costs and the efficacy of that tech is just going to be a benefit to the sector.
Chris, do you want to jump in next?
Yeah, so we work in drug development, and so I focus in different disease areas. And obviously, the hottest drug development area right now is obesity. So many of you may already know the drugs that are available for obesity, which can now really result in 20 to 30% weight loss for patients, which is incredible, not just in terms of their health benefit, but in terms of long-term outcomes, longer survival, less heart attacks, less strokes, less other diseases. So it's a huge indication for our industry, and this is going to be a massive wave. This will be the largest indication that our sector has ever seen. There are over 140 million patients in the US alone who are obese and need treatment. And so from that perspective, the way I see health obesity is that this is a tremendous indication where we're making great progress. That revenue that comes into the system will be used for new innovation, which will apply to cancer and autoimmune disease and other areas of drug development. So that's going to be one of the biggest waves, I think, within biotechnology over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, so lots of implications beyond just the weight loss and the obesity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, we're fortunate enough we get to sit down and interview a lot of these PMs who are actually on the front line. So it's interesting to see sort of when these names go from being differentiators to sort of common to in every portfolio.
Yeah.
So from our point of view, there's a few names, and then there's sort of the next derivatives that we see coming in the portfolios. It's a very interesting space to follow.
Great. And Chris, I've heard you talk about the sort of COVID hangover that we're still in. Do you want to explain that to people?
Yeah, so within biotech, I mean, 2020, there was a huge amount of attention that was paid to our sector, primarily because, quite humbly, biotech saved the world, right? We developed all the diagnostics, the therapeutics, the vaccines that were required to get us out of COVID. Huge amount of money came into the sector, and probably too much money came into the sector, quite honestly, over 2020 and 21. So 22 and 23 and 24 have really been kind of recovery years for the sector. So I would say, it's been a rough time within biotech, but if you're interested in getting into biotech, it's a great time, right? Because we've basically been in recovery as a sector for the last 3 years. And the most important thing is that the long-term prospects of the sector look great, right? The aging demographic and the innovation are all you have to remember for the next 20 years in biotech. So from that perspective, I think we are still in the midst of biotech recovery, but really with the long-term projections of what the sector will look like, especially diseases like obesity and the impacts on our sector overall, I think we see growth probably for the next 20 to 30 years.
Joe, do you agree with that? Are you seeing more opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like a different perspective.
Yeah.
Complete COVID hangover. It's different on the buyout side. We're actually still working through the implications of COVID in the services part of healthcare in this country. If you think about what happened, and this is pretty dramatic when you think about it from this perspective, our hospital systems who historically had been operating at single-digit margins almost all went bankrupt without government intervention. The way people are receiving their care, the push that payers are having to push care out of the hospital into lower cost settings, where you're getting primary care, which suddenly people realize, which in the industry you knew, suddenly people realize we just don't have enough primary care docs to even come close to supporting our needs. That has been a huge transition. And so you're seeing low acuity care, is what I call it, being those needs being met in different ways. Rather than waiting 9 months for your dermatologist, you're going to go online, get a script, and get fulfilled in a week. That is a big change in how people get their health care, and it's happened in the last 5 years. And the implications around how all of the pieces are going to move around, that's where I spend my time, and that's what I think is exciting. But COVID is still in healthcare, both on the product side, but also on how it's delivered, is continuing to have a meaningful impact.
Yeah, even the delivery of our drugs, for example, has changed a lot. So for example, drugs that used to be delivered intravenously for the treatment, let's say, of your disease like rheumatoid arthritis, we're now trying to move those into oral drugs, right, where drugs that patients can take as outpatients. That's been a massive trend in the field of autoimmunity, for example. So we're seeing that on the drug development side as well as the delivery side.
Yeah.
That's great. And Thomas, we talked a little bit about the COVID hangover has been a little bit different for you as an allocator, as you look at managers and are trying to evaluate. I mean, you've said, you know, you spend 100 days on the road. How are you finding managers that you want to work with when people were sitting on Zoom for 2 years?
The Zoom period was not great for someone who loves being on the road.
Yeah.
But what we are seeing is both sort of at company level, but at the managers, and the way people interact has changed a lot over a very short period of time. So when you're trying to identify either, you know, a management team that has what it takes to bring a drug to market, or, you know, the right managers to allocate capital to, a lot of the research that used to happen by actually going out to the company is now done on Zoom. And a lot of the interactions that we have with each other, a lot of the relationships that we're trying to build, we're having to find new avenues to do that and assess, you know, what are we losing and what are we gaining. So it adds some complexity that we didn't used to have.
Well, hopefully you have an opportunity to do some of that while you're here. So as we're ringing in the new year, what does the immediate investment landscape look like?
Yeah, so on the buyout side and squarely in the middle market, it's actually pretty exciting. We've had a pretty slow period for a couple of years in terms of opportunities. There's been a mismatch, everyone knows, in terms of marks, asset availability, and being able to actually put the dollars to work. That is starting to unwind.
Do you feel like there's a sense of uncertainty still, or things are starting to normalize?
I think the biggest reason why investments have slowed down are just value expectations at the GP level were different from kind of value expectations from an exit perspective as a new investor. That's starting to change, which is great to see. And I think the other piece, which again, the next 12 months is going to be pretty telling, the private equity market really does rely on the IPO market to come back. Outside of tech and biotech, it's been almost non-existent. And so if you start to see that start to uncrack, I think you'll also see the deal volume start to pick up.
You're talking about the reliance on the different pieces. I'd love to hear from all of you, how do you see collaboration between investors, corporations, and the healthcare system sort of driving this innovation? Maybe, do you want to start?
I mean, M&A is a huge dynamic within biotech, because if you think about it, pharmaceutical companies are really big distributors of drugs. They can go to Indonesia, they can go to Pensacola, Florida. So they distribute drugs worldwide, but what they need is new innovation and new drugs to bring into that pipeline. So they are constantly partnering, acquiring, and interacting with our small biotech companies to bring in that pipeline. So we're going to see more and more M&A, right? Especially as more money comes in from obesity and from other indications. They're going to redeploy that capital to basically buy companies and to bring into the pipeline. So collaboration between large companies and small companies are incredibly important. We're also seeing collaborations also with healthcare, let's say payers, right? So nowadays when we develop a drug, we have to show that it's pharmacoeconomically viable in addition to medically viable, right? We have to show that it saves the system money, that it actually improves the overall cost trends of healthcare within the United States. So again, I think we're seeing when we develop a drug, we have to anticipate all of these different aspects, not just the medical benefits to patients.
Do you want to jump in on that as an investor?
I actually have a follow-up question.
Sure.
Sure. Oh.
So drug development in China is playing a much bigger part. How does that factor in?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So China for many years was basically an outsourced provider of let's say, services to the drug development industry. So you could hire a chemist in China for literally 20% of what you could hire a chemist in the US, and probably 1/10 of what you would cost in Europe, for example. And then what happened is those chemists would do work for us. At first, they would do just kind of boring work like, hey, make these comparator compounds for my studies. But then what they were doing is they were doing actually copycat drugs. That was the next stage. So they would take a drug that we made in the US and they would copy it. And they'd say, I'm going to make a slightly different version. It's not better, it's not worse, but I'll just sell it in China where your drug is not yet available. But what's interesting now is China now makes best-in-class drugs. They actually, when they take a target of a drug that we make already in the US, they can make a better version. So they've really climbed up, I would say, on the skill curve there. And so now, for example, a company like BeiGene, which is probably the best Chinese biotech company, they truly have a best-in-class drug for chronic lymphocytic leukemia. It's truly the best. It's been shown to be better in clinical trials. So the other thing is now there's so much innovation there. We're seeing a lot of business development out of China as well. So in fact, we actually at NPM just opened up an office out of Singapore. We're going to be doing business development with Chinese companies basically to bring those assets to the US, which is really still, let's say, the biggest market in the world and the best place to develop your drug. So China is a really big theme across the industry. We're also seeing big deals coming out of major pharmaceutical companies for assets in China. So they just become, it's like every other industry. They kind of climb their way up, like kind of stepwise, and then boom, they're there. Kind of like AI did yesterday, I guess.
Yeah.
Did you want to jump in on that also?
Sure. So I mean, look, I think healthcare. It's I've been in it my entire career. It is a very interrelated industry, and so the way corporations, I think historically, it's been one of the most active M&A sectors, biotech and even outside biotech. And the way to invest is really to make sure that you have the relationships on the corporate side. And as an investor, what you're really looking for is how to grow businesses in the broader healthcare ecosystem. So it's just one of those industries where you have to think more broadly when you're investing.
You've talked a little bit about pricing and access. When you think about social impact and hopefully people are getting into the health investing space to do good in the world, but how do you sort of balance the profit-driven goals with the broader mission of improving lives and outcomes?
It's one of the things in healthcare where, as an investor, you're fully aligned with the patient. If you're in the healthcare world and you're investing in a company where that alignment, there's a mismatch, you are not going to do well. The healthcare ecosystem, whether it's payers, individual patients, it all matters when you're thinking about growth in a business. So there's full alignment from that perspective. I think where people make mistakes is when they're focused on the profit pools, because you will get stuck in the system at some point. The idea of making healthcare more universal, I lean on the tech industry. Again, this is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. It'll take time. But there is a big difference between getting sick in New York City and getting sick in rural America in terms of the quality of care, the decision making, and its lack of information. I personally think the best social benefit of AI is going to be democratizing that information for the benefit of physicians, irrespective of where you operate and where you work. So socially, that's where I'd like to get to, but I think it's pretty far away.
And Thomas, as an allocator, are you thinking about that in your decisions with managers, or is it purely about the return?
No, so we are a financial investor, but we do try to set standards for the companies that we invest in, for the managers that we invest with. So we have a number of expectation documents that we publish. We distribute them to all of our investment companies. We discuss them with our managers. And no manager is going to get hired because they have a good ESG or impact policy, but it does need to be a part of their investment process.
Yeah, hopefully, particularly with health. Do you want to add to that?
I was going to say pricing is always also a big concern within drug development and biotechnology. The Inflation Reduction Act actually put together rules which limits the pricing of certain drugs over time. And that's definitely had an impact on the way we do business within biotech drug development. But I think the things that we have to remember is this. Pricing trends overall are coming down, for sure, within biotechnologies and drugs. But what we as an industry need to do is to be more efficient in the way, right? Because what we're focused on is IRR and returns that we create. We need to put less money in, even if less money is coming out. So from that perspective, you know, the use of AI in drug development that was mentioned, that's really important, right? Our ability, for example, to not have to manually screen drugs through high throughput screening, but to design them using computer algorithms is really going to save time and basically make our drug development process more efficient. So that's another kind of theme on the topic with related to pricing and reimbursement in healthcare.
So switching places a little bit, where do you think the biggest barriers are to innovation right now? Is it all just about regulation? Are there other barriers we're facing?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say, you know, regulatory complexity is always a headwind. You know, certain disease areas are just really hard to develop drugs for. So think about Alzheimer's. It literally takes thousands of patients in a clinical trial, and you have to follow them for years, right, to figure out if your Alzheimer's drug works. That makes it really hard to do and really expensive. That means that a phase 3 clinical trial in Alzheimer's will cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and that the entire development will cost $1 billion, right? So what we really need to do from a regulatory perspective is to figure out, well, how else can we measure improvement and efficacy of our drugs short of these long, complex clinical trials, right? In cancer, we're able to do that because we use something called surrogate endpoints. We don't have to wait to see whether patients live or die. We can see whether tumors shrink or grow. We can also look at DNA that's floating around in the blood to see if it's going up or down. And that tumor DNA will tell you if the drug is working or not. So again, I think it's some combination of technology plus new regulatory requirements, which accept the new technology once it's mature enough. And that can transform. We used to see drug development in kidneys take years. You could never get a kidney drug developed because you had to prove that you prevented dialysis, which take years. Now it turns out if you can just measure the amount of protein in your urine, you can demonstrate that in 6 months. So drug development in kidneys went from 6 years to 6 months. That means many new drugs will be developed, right? So that's the kind of innovation in both regulatory science and in technology and medicine that we need to see to make these processes more rapid.
And what about on the buyout side?
It's a perpetual question, who's going to pay for it?
Yeah.
Healthcare that's the fundamental question in every investment that I think about.
Yeah.
The big pools of capital are pharma and biotech and the payers. Everybody else it's a zero-sum game. Where is the capital coming from? I think what's interesting and where we're spending a little bit of time is consumers are getting more involved in their healthcare, and as costs go up, that trend should continue. So there might be an emerging third pool of capital, but cost is a big thing on top of obviously all the regulatory complexity.
So we just have even a few seconds left. I want to do just a quick lightning round of I'm sure there are some people in this audience who don't have a lot of experience investing in health. Thomas, I'd love for you to give actually the manager some advice from an allocator perspective, and if the other two of you could give sort of the allocators in the room some advice.
I think sort of the key experience from having interviewed a lot of managers is if you want a differentiated view, you have to do some differentiated research.
Great.
You have to figure out what that is.
Okay, Joe?
Specialization
Yeah.
in this sector, you can't fake it. You have to be deep and really understand what you're doing, but the broader context as well.
And Chris?
I think everyone should have some portion of their portfolio in healthcare and biotech, because just remember, aging demographic and innovation, that's going to drive growth for the next 20 years.
Well, with that, thank you for joining us today, and thank you to iConnections for having us.